Somehow, over my entire life, I've never been able to get into any Warhammer games or lore. Despite being a lover of science fiction and gritty world building, I never gave the setting the shot it deserved, at least until the recent release of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. It's another in-depth CRPG made from the team behind the beloved Pathfinder series. But because I personally disliked actually playing their previous games so much, I was worried that this would just be more of the same. However, when I finally gave Rogue Trader a shot, I fell utterly in love. First and foremost, the setting of Rogue Trader is unrivaled in how deep and cool it is. Playing as a Rogue Trader yourself, you are given explicit permissions to explore lesser known and controlled parts of human space, full of strange monsters, fringe societies, and never before seen magic and tech. And along with this, you are granted a massive capital ship home to thousands of slave workers and robots in the lower decks, along with a ruling elite and your powerful companions up top. This isn't your standard RPG where everything is sweet and nice and the bad decisions amount to nothing more than saying a mean thing to an NPC here and there. This is a dark and gritty universe characterized by death and destruction, along with truly horrifying backstories and lore on how things work. For example, in order for your ship to travel through what is known as the warp in order to get to faraway places, your ship must be led by a navigator, a multi-eyed paranormal magic-infused monstrosity of a human being that screams and sees nightmares as they slowly die, keeping you alive in the perils of this mystic place. And throughout your entire adventure, which just like Pathfinder is very long, you get to travel to tons of diverse and interesting planets, all with their own problems, many of which again are dark and horrific, but because of that makes the setting feels so much more grounded and engrossing. Without exaggeration, after completing this game for the first time, my appreciation for Warhammer 40k lore went from not even caring about it to becoming utterly absorbed and regarding it as one of the coolest universes in not just games, but entertainment entirely. And in a lot of ways, Rogue Trader also serves as the perfect starting off point for those who haven't already gotten into Warhammer, because of how it slowly introduces you to this awesome world. And on top of this too, as an RPG, Rogue Trader excels on almost all levels. Combat and tactics are front and center with multiple different classes to pick from that are all unlike anything I've seen in most other RPGs that allow you to command the battlefield and spawn allies to take on massive amounts of foes. Blood and gore will spill across the battlefield as you wage war, and when you're done, instead of having to pick up every pointless common item one by one, you can simply send all the lower level gear to your ship instantly to help you build up massive stockpiles which you can use to buy better gear from factions and vendors later. And it's systems like these in conjunction with all the fun choices you get to make on your adventure and the consequences that unearth because of them that make Rogue Trader such a powerful role-playing experience. It's grand in every sense of the word, and while it doesn't ever quite reach the levels of say Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, with its mythic paths and multi-hundred-hour story, it makes up for it with what I think is much better moment-to-moment gameplay and a world that is utterly captivating, rather than feeling generic and boring every second you walk around, like in Pathfinder, in my opinion at least. Or in other words, in a lot of ways, Rogue Trader for me is everything I want out of RPGs I play. An intense and brutal world with tough decisions to make, world building and lore that will have you spending hours watching YouTube videos or reading books about things you missed, and smart decisions and design that make combat and gameplay really smooth and easy to get into. Fascinating and unique worlds to explore, along with a hefty amount of tactics to employ at higher levels that keep things fresh. So if you're looking for a very deep and long RPG to sink your teeth into, with a world that you'll never forget, I cannot recommend enough one of the newest RPGs I've played, and also one of the best, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. As many of you who watch my channel frequently know, it's difficult for me to even go a single video without mentioning one of my favorite games and semi-RPGs of all time, Prey. It's not only the greatest immersive sim game ever made, but also came from a studio that no longer exists, meaning hoping for Wolfeye to carry on the legacy into the future is our only hope, now with the IP being left dormant for years. But despite the sad circumstances Arcane Austin found themselves in after releasing Redfall, Prey, their previous game, still is one of my favorite role-playing games and immersive sims of all time. First of all, the introduction to this title is without exaggeration the most fascinating and jaw-dropping I have ever ever seen in a video game, and immediately sets the stage for all the mind-bending twists to come. But even outside of how cool the introduction is, which I won't spoil here, the real genius of Prey lies in its gameplay, design, and world. From the ground up, every single environment you walk into is oozing with personality and lore, with multiple terminals or notes you can access that give you hints as to what exactly happened on this abandoned space station hurtling above Earth, and even beyond that, the design of each space is so immaculate too. Every single location in the game has multiple entrances and secret passageways, with a huge variety of interesting solutions you can use to either get around, fight enemies, or solve puzzles. A perfect example of this is how you can use the first weapon you get, the glue cannon, to not only freeze enemies in place for easy kills, but also to form makeshift bridges to hard to reach locations, all the way to putting out fires that would otherwise kill you. Each and every item, skill, or ability in-game has a whole handful of ways that it can be used to think outside the box, even down to literally stacking boxes you find in the environment to climb up to places if you have no other options. It's a type of RPG that at its core revolves around player freedom and expression, and when you combine that with truly riveting storytelling and narrative, which is only revealed to you slowly piece by piece, you are left with a psychological thriller of sorts, not only because of its narrative themes, but because of how the title makes you think to overcome problems. And on top of this, there's a robust upgrade system in the game that can radically change how you play, giving you powers that you have never seen in any other game that let you solve puzzles in extremely unique ways. It really is one of the most underrated games in history, and one that I highly recommend you give a shot regardless of what games you're into, but especially if you love RPGs and immersive sims. In fact, maybe even more underrated and potentially better than the base game itself is the Moon Crash DLC that almost no one bought, but quite literally revolutionizes the entire genre with new gameplay mechanics and the implementation of time. It was essentially Deathloop before Deathloop was ever released, and somehow miles better despite being created by the same company years before. And while it is once again something I will speak little on in fear of spoiling it for you, trust me when I say that beating this DLC along with the main game will instantly put Prey into a pantheon of one of your favorite games ever, if not the single best. Because sometimes the best RPGs don't have to be hyper-focused on skill checks, dialogue, deep builds, or choice and consequence, but rather just providing the player with a complete sense of freedom to play the way they want, with a full host of systems and ideas that come together in such an amazing way that you can't help but appreciate what an achievement it really all is. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I'm playing a new game, first impressions are everything. There are surely countless titles out there that I would love if I would force myself to play more, but because I value my time so greatly, it's seldom I ever give games a second chance whenever they fail to impress me quickly. However, sometimes the single best experiences out there are also the ones you eventually come back to, and in the case of Pillars of Eternity, that's exactly what happened. Despite hearing so many good things about the title from resources I trusted over the years, every time I personally tried to play the game, I immediately became frustrated with the overbearing and slow combat, lack of voice acting, and overall a world and story that was utterly confusing with so many names and places or references that I had no information on yet. It really is one of the most harsh starts to a video game I have ever played, and it made me actually stop playing after starting well over 5 times. But eventually, due to a lack of other titles to play, I finally sat down one evening and decided I would play this game for at least 5 hours to see where it went. And well, the rest is history. Although the game starts slow, a large reason for this is the amount of lore and history that it just dumps on you. At first, you have no idea what is going on, who any of the gods are, or what all of these events even mean. But as you slowly spend more and more days on this adventure, everything starts to make more sense. And when it does, you discover that you are playing a game with one of the best worlds and stories the gaming medium has ever seen. And I don't say that lightly. I have played lots and lots of RPGs or even just watched videos on synopsises on ones I haven't over multiple decades now, and Pillars of Eternity is without a doubt, in my opinion, one of the most interesting universes and narratives I've ever seen in an RPG. Focused on souls and the literal hierarchy and history of the gods themselves, the narrative of this first game and its world tackles so many utterly fascinating themes that I don't otherwise think about much. And on top of that, the actual immersion of the universe as well is unmatched. Things like religion and how certain technologies work are fully considered in terms of political structures, how societies form, and the history of the entire world. It's clear from just playing the game that someone or a group of developers on this game are very interested in history and really did their homework. And I can't dive into specifics and worries that I would spoil one of the best stories and twists I have ever seen in a game, but just know that if you do spend the time getting past the rough start in this title, you will be rewarded with top-tier world building and lore that makes the lack of voice acting a non-issue almost, as you get fully swept into reading paragraphs of text about fake events that still seem so real. And not only that, but the more you play the game too, the better and better the combat starts to get, with more access to multiple spells per rest and a full party of 6 characters that can unleash some truly devastating combos that fill the screen with particles everywhere. The combat is rich in depth and freedom of expression, and there are many fights that will be genuinely challenging to overcome on the higher difficulties, requiring you to use everything you have in your tool bag. It's the kind of system that at first is overbearing and cumbersome, but over time blossoms into an addicting loop where you will be giddy waiting for the next big engagement. And this becomes even more apparent in the White March DLC, where more varied and fantastical combat encounters are commonplace, along with a story that really fleshes out lesser known parts of this fantastic world. And even more than that, because Pillars was designed from the ground up to be a computer game first, not a tabletop system translated to PC, the actual mechanics are much more interesting in my opinion than say D&D or Pathfinder based games where you will get bogged down in pointless stat tracking that wouldn't have been there if tabletop didn't exist first. The thing is though, some of you may be wondering then, if I like the gameplay and mechanics so much, why don't I have Pillars of Eternity 2 above the first game? After all, in Pillars 2, there are a whole host of much needed improvements and additions to mechanics and gameplay for this system. Well, it once again comes back to the absolutely amazing story of Pillars 1 that has maybe my single favorite twist in a video game of all time. Not because it's the most awe-inspiring or least expected, but because it forces us to think about our real lives, about societies, about faith, gods, belief, and the meaning of the universe and humanity itself. Funnily enough, in a lot of ways, I know most people would say games like, for example, Planescape Torment are better than Pillars in terms of philosophy, but for me, Pillars actually asks the single most interesting questions you can, and for that reason, it deserves a playthrough just for that. And along the way too, you will be forced into a world that is utterly captivating at every step, where reading random lore dumps becomes no longer tedious, and instead, truly interesting dives into a culture built atop the echoes of the past. Even the ideas of souls and how they work in this universe, or the entire premise of the main character becoming a watcher and what that all means, is Obsidian writing at its very best. So if you haven't played Pillars of Eternity yet, or you're like me and have tried it but hated it, I urge you to give this game a shot, because not only will it make the second game so much better, but you will be treated to my favorite RPG story and world since Mass Effect, a juggernaut of writing and world building that never got the love it deserves. The type of game that will make you instantly buy any other game in the same universe despite how bad it is, because the world is just that good and you'll be begging for more. It would be practically impossible at this point to make a ranking list about RPGs without mentioning what many people would consider the GOAT, Baldurs Gate 3. It's an absolutely massive and sprawling adventure that takes place over 3 acts, all of which are filled to the brim with hours and hours of top quality content. But for me, what really makes this game so special is the reactivity. It feels like for any action you can think of, no matter how big or small, there is a highly produced, fully voice acted, or gameplay heavy way in which the game radically realizes you. You can turn into a spider in order to talk to spiders about uprising against their captors, or if you choose to play as a drow when you first enter the goblin camp in Act 1, rather than having to fight your way through hordes of devilish creatures, they simply cower in fear as you easily walk past, due to your race's notable harsh nature in the underground. Each and every interaction you have in game is filled with moments like this, and every mission, whether that be from the main story or one of the side gigs, can be solved in quite literally any way you can think of. There are even people online who have stacked hundreds of boxes into the air and climbed up all of them in order to get to higher levels of a castle to invade it unseen, or others who made mile-long explosive barrel connections to kill the entire goblin camp without having to even walk in the front. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of immersive Sims and the same reasons I love those games. But what Baldur's Gate 3 does so well is that it marries these genres perfectly, that being deep CRPGs and also very intricate immersive Sims, and makes an experience that really puts the role-playing back in role-playing games. Having the freedom to choose exactly what you want to do, whether that is in dialogue or combat, is so exhilarating. And I actually really love how every action you take depends on the roll of the dice, meaning sometimes, even if you're fully kitted out, something crazy can happen, and it really makes the narrative and everything happening way more dynamic. Especially because once you realize how open-ended the journey is, it makes you excited to come up with strange solutions for how you're going to solve everything. For me, it's just the perfect example of everything that an RPG should be. It's to the point where I could think of pretty much any other game on this list, and I would prefer that it had the same game philosophy and design and gameplay approach of Baldur's Gate 3, even if I actually like their stories better. And that's because the design of Baldur's Gate 3 is all about radically realizing whatever you do as the player. It's the holy grail of what RPGs were meant to do in the first place. After all, they're based on Dungeons and Dragons, somewhere where you kind of can do whatever you want. Because that's what makes RPGs special in the first place. The ability to create our own characters and tell our own stories, or have an effect on the world that truly feels real, with deep gameplay mechanics for combat and leveling up our characters. That way we can make them really our own. Funnily enough though, despite all I've been saying in the rest of this list, I actually think that the writing in Baldur's Gate 3 along with its world might be its weakest part. I personally find the universe of Dungeons and Dragons so boring, dull, and generic. And when you combine that with almost Marvel-esque quips and one-liners along with companions and NPCs that are all extremely over-sexualized, the gravity of the plot and the main story really loses a lot of luster, instead being traded out for an experience that is more akin to actually playing at a Dungeons and Dragons tabletop with friends, all the wackiness included. It's for sure something that a lot of people enjoy as well, but for me, I tend to gravitate more towards serious narratives and plots that take place in worlds that bring up grand philosophical questions and answers, like say the Pillars of Eternity universe, or places that are extremely funny and just fun, like say Wasteland 3. Regardless though, in spite of the lackluster world and writing, something I value very highly in my RPGs, don't get me wrong, the rest of the package in Baldur's Gate 3 is executed at such a high level that it's hard not to put it this high on my list. Having this much dialogue, this much content, so many options for how to tackle each situation can only happen when you have a developer who is fully focused on making the best product they can with lots of long hours and passion behind it. And truthfully, no other RPG in history has really had this much depth, while also having this high of a production value. And for that reason, Baldur's Gate 3 stands alone in a league of its own, that hopefully will push the industry and the RPG genre forward for decades to come. It's one of the all-time great RPGs without a doubt, even with its flaws, and stands as a testament to how much one studio can really change the gaming landscape. Putting Cyberpunk 2077 as the best game I have played on an RPG ranking list might be one of the most sacrilegious things you can do. And that's because while it was touted as the next generation of role-playing games shortly before release, immediately after, the game was ripped to shreds for not only the relentless bugs and issues, but the fact that it wasn't as deep mechanically as many RPG lovers really wanted. But you see, while Cyberpunk doesn't have the deep choices and consequences of old-school BioWare titles, the unrivaled lore and world building of the Pillars series, or a radically reactive world like Prey or Baldur's Gate 3, it does capitalize on something more important than all of that: the moments. I'm not the type of person that usually feels especially emotional playing games, watching movies, or reading books. So when something can actually make me feel something deeply, that's how I know I'm engaging with something special. And in the case of Cyberpunk 2077, it's a game that practically is made to evoke things like this. From the way characters move in dialogue and how their eyes trace across yours, to amazing delivery and lines that truly bring you into the scene. And stitching this all together is truly deep and interesting writing about a world that has been thrust into utter chaos, with mega corporations dictating the rules of humanity and hackers turning people's brains into mush. But throughout it all, the beauty of this RPG is what really makes it stand out, and how characters and their arcs unfold, and how you can simply walk around any point in this city and look up to be enveloped by buildings reaching into the sky and a bevy of neon lights. Without a doubt, no city in any game, RPG or otherwise, even holds a candle to Night City in Cyberpunk 2077, where it becomes a character of its own that genuinely feels like an actual place. Every street corner is either littered in trash or exuberance, and because of how well done the environments are in Night City, and especially Dogtown from the DLC, you will literally fall in love instantly. And as if it couldn't get any better, the music is my favorite in any game ever, with countless tracks that evoke a somber feeling of sadness, quickly followed by the crescendo of a heroic rise to power. Cyberpunk 2077 at its core is an RPG that focuses on making players feel something, rather than just contemplating what to upgrade at the next level. Even with this focus, the actual build diversity with hacking, melee, run and gun, or sneaking is diverse and interesting no matter which path you choose to take. And each mission or side quest also has almost immersive sim-like design, where you have multiple options on how to tackle objectives, with many quests that also have dialogue choices that will affect what happens. None of these deeper RPG elements on their own are what makes Cyberpunk my favorite RPG ever though. After all, you can choose any category and find a peer that probably does it better. The thing that no game, even outside of RPGs in my opinion, has been able to beat Cyberpunk on is once again the feeling it gives you and the way it evokes your soul. Looking in Judy's eyes after she loses the only person she had left she loved. Watching as Johnny Silverhand molds himself into a good man again, all for you. Or simply confiding in a loved one who is on the verge of taking their own life. I've played so many RPGs in my now multiple decades playing video games, but I have never played one that truly taught me the lessons that this game did. Not from a level up screen or from branching dialogue and interesting consequences to my choices, but from characters that light a fire in our souls and put a sparkle in our eyes for just how great humanity can be, even in its worst moments. That even in a world thrust into chaos, can rise the souls of a few who will stop at nothing to be there for others. A game that has such amazing writing, in such a dark, gritty, and interesting world, paired with characters that feel so real that you can't help but become fully immersed, dragging your body and soul into V's the more you play. Because RPGs, just like any other game, are a form of art, but Cyberpunk is the highest of those forms. A role-playing game that doesn't just let you step into the shoes of a character in a faraway world, but one whose very essence is so strong, so meaningful, and so memorable that its teachings spread into you as well.